don't have to worry about pulling yourself out of a trance. You come out. As far as I can see, most of spirituality serves the dream state much more than it serves the awakened state. Some of it serves the awakened state, and that's a nice thing. But you kind of got to pick through it like looking for needles in a haystack sometimes, you know? To find the jewels. So this isn't theory. It's not some spiritual philosophy or theology. If you just are quiet, you can feel this inextricable movement. It's not actually an upward movement, any more than if there's a pail of bucket of water and there's a hole in the bottom, it just drains down. And so we don't actually help the process along. We don't make it happen. It's more like you let it happen. Instead of chasing enlightenment, if you want to do anything, spend your time looking at each moment how you manage to unenlighten yourself. Forget about chasing enlightenment. That's like a dog chasing its tail so that it can become a dog. Right? If I just bite that thing right there, if I just catch up, then I will achieve this thing called dogness, which is enlightenment for a dog. How ridiculous, right? What's the point? It would be much better for the dog to sit around noticing how he inextricably continues to convince himself that he's not a dog. That would be much more useful than tail chasing, wouldn't you say? Spirituality is the same way. Don't worry about awakening. Don't worry about enlightenment. Don't worry about reality. Don't chase it and grasp it and try to imagine what it's like and all of that. If you're going to do anything, just look at any moment. How am I unenlightening myself right now? How is it that I'm pulling off the ultimate miracle of seeing separation where there isn't any? How is it that in the midst of a reality which is everything is at one, how am I actually pulling off this amazing, magical feat of not perceiving it? That would be much more relevant. And not only would it be much more relevant, it would be much more empowering, because then you get to look at you, right? You don't have to chase around somebody else's silly little experience that they told you about, that you think you want. That's very disempowering. It's no fun. It's running around hoping that some wonderful thing will happen. Who wants to do that forever? Because the truth is just the opposite. That's the miracle of this all. See, to me, illusion is the miracle. Reality's not a miracle. How could it be? It's just reality. Everything's just one. And oneness is not a mystical experience, okay? It's not expanded consciousness. It's not those moments at the beach where your head like expands forever and you merge with the waves and you know what I mean. I don't know. Those are nice experiences, don't get me wrong. I like them as much as anybody else. But they're misleading because those get mixed in with what oneness is. And then oneness becomes sort of this mystical, magical fantasy. But when it starts to dawn on you, it's just the underlying sense of sameness. You just see through the lie, like, no, it's not actually true that we are inherently different, that anything is inherently different. Everything looks different. Of course it looks different. But when your denial of the underlying unity breaks down, you see, actually, it's the same thing somehow, appearing in many ways. It's not a mystical experience. It's practical, it's simple. See, Bonky was running around chasing something for 9 years. That's what made it difficult. He didn't wake up because he found what he was chasing. He woke up because his chasing burned itself out. It was purged out of his system. It was like someone imagine someone is jogging on a path, and you jog next to him and you say, where are you going? Oh, I'm looking for rest. Why don't you stop? Because I haven't found rest yet. But you can find it if you stop. I've been running for so long, I don't actually know how to stop. I've forgotten if what you say is true, that's nice, but I don't even know how to stop my feet. But I'm sure if I keep running, I'll find rest. So the chap runs and runs and runs and runs and runs, right? If it was me, I would just say, hell, accelerate, sprint. It's right there around the corner, you see? But get there, someone else is beating you. And if it's not around that corner, run like hell to the next corner. Full speed. Don't slow, no matter how tired you get, don't slow down. Why? Well, he might exhaust himself, right? That's what Bonky did. It's like he didn't find, like, rest because he found, like, rest as something out there. He found rest because he exhausted the seeking. And all of a sudden, he stopped. It's like that. It's like someone running who's looking for rest and they get exhausted, and so they can't run. And so for a moment, they sort of inextricably stop. And their body at that point knows, oh, rest. Their mind doesn't need to know rest. It's not important. But their body knows. And then, of course, their mind will laugh. Good Lord, this rest was actually, at any point I could have stopped. So you see, if you were Bonky and you were like that person running, and then you rest, and then you finally exhausted yourself enough to stop, you might spend the rest of your life telling people, all that running around is not necessary. Rest, all you have to do is stop running. That's all. Enlightenment, just stop looking around the corner for it. All those things that we think are in our mind that we're chasing, stop chasing all that. If you're ready for this kind of message, then a stopping will happen quite spontaneously. Enlightenment is simply not perceiving through ego. It's not seeing life or anything. Self, others, your tennis shoes, your dog, your cat, your livelihood. anything. It's just not seeing the world, not seeing everything through the distortion called egoic state of consciousness. That is why it's been likened to the natural state. Natural meaning it's not an alternative lens, distorting lens, it's just perception without a lens, without a distortion. Ultimately, that's what enlightenment is. It's perception without distortion. Whether it's perceiving the nature of what you think is yourself, which there isn't one, whether it's whether it is perceiving a thought, whether it is perceiving a feeling, whether it is perceiving a situation, whether it's perceiving your relationship. It is simply perceiving not through the lens of ego. That's what enlightenment is. And it's useful to at least have some basis of understanding in this. Because an awakening, or in Zen what they call satori experience, seeing beyond the veil, itself, seen without the veil of ego, may be the true perception, the natural perception, the undistorted perception. But what most people want to do is they think enlightenment is like an unending satori experience, right? An unending enlightenment experience, an unending awakening experience, an unending experience. But it's not an unending experience at all. It has nothing to do with an unending experience. That misunderstanding will get you to do more tail chasing than you ever dreamed possible. In the end, enlightenment has very little to do with enlightenment experiences. It is simply not perceiving through the lens of ego. That's what it is. And there's no doubt, it's pretty good not perceiving through the lens of ego. It's happiness. It's peace. It's the end of your search. Not that you find anything except sanity. Not that you attain anything except seeing things as they actually are. And that's what nirvana is, seeing things as they actually are. So when you see things as they naturally are, you see everything is one. And the nature of anything and everything is not nearly as substantial as you thought. Its nature is emptiness. The nature of anything is nothingness. The nature of anything and everything is that it's all insubstantial. And so these these aren't some altered states of consciousness, you see. From the enlightened perspective, everything else is an altered state of consciousness. Does that make sense? Ego is the if you want to have altered states of consciousness, most people are already in one of the more wild altered states of consciousness. It's called egoic state of consciousness. It's a wildly altered state of consciousness. It gets you to perceive things that aren't there. It gets you to see enemies where there aren't any. It gets you to see dualities where there aren't any. It gets you to have things like a self-image when there isn't a self there to begin with. It gets you to have certain thoughts about yourself when in actuality the only thing that could be called a self at all is simply the thoughts you have about it. So if you want an altered state of consciousness, I'd stick with ego. It's about as advanced as you're going to get. It is existence, doing its damnedest, its best job at altering consciousness. And yet in spirituality, somehow, spirituality got associated with altered states of consciousness. You can alter your state of consciousness. Lots of the types of spirituality that people practice, they'll alter your state of consciousness. You can chant God's name for 4 or 5 hours, you'll notice your consciousness starts to alter, change. You'll feel different, things will look different. All sorts of things you can do to alter your state of consciousness. But the funny thing is, enlightenment has nothing to do with any of that. Enlightenment is the unaltered state of consciousness. Consciousness needs no alteration to see that everything is one. Since everything is one, you don't need an altered state of consciousness to perceive that everything is one. You need an altered state of consciousness to perceive that everything is actually more than one. Like 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 or 1,000. So in these moments, in Zen, they call them satoris, we often call them awakenings. In the awakening, the valuable thing about the awakening is how much of egoic consciousness falls away in the awakening. In the end, the next week or the next month, that's all that's going to matter. Because the experience, the sense of aha, which you get upon the awakening to your true nature, aha, I thought I was that, but that I thought I was just an imagination. What a relief. It's a great aha. But you're not going to have an aha forever, are you? A week later, your aha is going to be quite gone. Right? You ever notice that? You had the biggest revelation in the world. Oh my God! And then a week later, it's like, yeah, well, So it's not the quality of the aha sustaining, because it won't sustain itself. Which is great, because that means you can always have another one. The significant thing about those moments, though, those satoris or awakening to your true nature, is how much of the egoic consciousness falls away. That's because that's what you're going to live with, right? That's what's going to be with you the next week, the next month, the next year, maybe the next lifetime. And as the point of orientation, or the what to focus on, since egoic state of consciousness, duality, seeing things as duality through the lens of duality, it's actually something that must be constantly maintained. The egoic state of consciousness actually takes a great amount of energy and a great amount of effort. Since it's not true, it has to keep building this falseness constantly, otherwise it will end. Because what is not true ends as soon as it's not being fueled. And so illusion, or the egoic state of consciousness, must constantly be fueled like a fire, right? Or like a coal stove, which you must keep shoveling fuel into it. So the useful spiritual disciplines are simply ways of not putting more energy into egoic consciousness. That's basically what they're doing. Stop fueling it. Stop fueling it and it can't sustain itself. But in just the mere act of sitting in silence, being the silence, because that's what is there to be revealed, is that sitting in silence is not a goal. The goal of sitting is not to attain silence, that is to mistake it. There isn't a goal. There is just the sitting in silence and recognizing yourself to be the silence, and everything else to be but a mental projection. Everything. Sitting in silence is one of the best meters, the best truth meters we have, because if it doesn't exist when you're sitting in silence, then it doesn't actually exist. And if you hold up so much of what's in your mind to that standard, if it doesn't exist when I'm not thinking about it, that means it doesn't exist. Not much holds up to such a high standard, does it? Most everything crumbles. If it doesn't exist when I'm not thinking about it, then it can't be real. Not ultimately real. Very, very little actually survives this test. At least very little that we hold to be real survives this test. And that's something that sitting in silence can actually show us, if we want to see it. If we don't see it as a goal-centered activity in which I'm just trying to do it well or right or get really good at it, that we see sitting in silence is actually an opportunity to see into the true nature of things. And so it doesn't need to be overvalued or undervalued. If it's thought only as a means to an end, then it's overvalued. Because we think you must do this in order to achieve a certain end, meditating as a means to get to a spiritual goal. Then we tend to adhere to ideas that say we must meditate a certain amount and a lot, and it's sort of the highway to enlightenment. But that's to turn it into a goal. As soon as we turn it into a goal, then it is trapped within what I call the dream state. A state of consciousness which is dominated by the mind, which is created by the mind. The dream state is just another word for mental consciousness, actually believing the mental noise in one's head, which is the common state of consciousness. The common state of consciousness of humanity is one in which human beings believe the mental noise in their head. And so because of that, most human beings have this absolutely compulsive relationship with thought. They think compulsively. It's like an addiction, as if you would sort of cease to be if you didn't think. Well, that may actually end up being true on one level. Especially when we see that our whole idea of ourselves is just that. It's just an idea of ourselves. Then that, of course, ceases to be. But in a very simple manner of speaking, that's all awakening is. It's our consciousness going from this dream state in which we are caught in a compulsive nature of thought and its worldview and its self-view. And going from this, which is itself a dream state created by thinking, and going through that state of consciousness which is not perceiving from thought, where thought is no longer compulsively always moving. And so therefore we're not deriving our sense of self from it, our sense of reality from it. So that state of consciousness that is not caught in a compulsive state of mind, compulsive thinking, that state of consciousness which is outside of compulsive thinking, that's the state of awakening. That's the state of enlightenment, but it's actually just a state. That's why they call it pure consciousness. It's just pure. It's just pure perception, pure awareness. No compulsive labeling. So most human beings, we have to label everything, right? Everything's good or bad or beautiful or ugly, or everyone is right or wrong, or beautiful or ugly, or safe or not safe. Everything in the dream state of consciousness is compulsively labeled. We know what should and shouldn't be happening. We know what should and shouldn't have happened. It's all this sort of compulsive nature of thinking. And the simplest way to talk about awakening is one wakes up from that. That's what awakening is. And as soon as we wake up from that, what we realize, not intellectually realize, our whole being realizes that, my God, there's no truth in it. There's no truth in that compulsive nature of thought. There's no truth in one's thoughts about themselves or others or the world or anything else. It doesn't mean you can't think. You can still think. It doesn't mean the thought never comes through your brain. Thought can still come through your brain. But it means that your sense of reality, of what is true, is no longer derived from the compulsive movement of thought. And then there's pure perception, pure consciousness. There's no interpretation. This is what unconditioned is. Unconditioned in a practical way, in a way that relates on a human level, just means not translating, not judging, not getting caught in the mind's matrix. Because the mind is always translating experience. And so a pure state of consciousness is when we're proceeding from outside of that whole movement. Whether that movement is happening or not doesn't much matter. But the domain of being is the you who you've always been. The you who hasn't grown up and hasn't grown down. The you that's not immature or mature. The you who's not an adult or a child or an adolescent. The you that you really, really are. And there's an intuition. Far before there's any awakening, far before there's any enlightenment, anybody, anywhere, if they get out of their minds for half a second, there's an intuition of always being themselves. Have you had the sense that you've always been yourself? Maybe not the self you think about, but there's just the sense that you've always been yourself. This is the intuition that's coming from being. Or in Zen we will call it emptiness. Because being is empty of content, it's empty of images, it's empty of self-references. It's something without form, without a particular attribute. So that's being. And really, when we awaken, we are immediately introduced, reintroduced, remembered, realized this being. That's what wakes up, is the being. Not the ego that's trying to awaken and making lots of effort and trying to figure everything out, and not the ego that may even be listening to my words thinking, I wonder what those mean. Like you were listening to some college discourse and you were looking for the meaning. That's what the egoic mind does. But awakening is essentially realizing that underneath that, underneath the exterior of that, the image you present to other people, underneath that image, underneath the image you present to yourself of who you are, underneath that image, that image is being worn by being, by a pure and radiant and awake emptiness. And that's the dimension of awakening, that's the dimension of being. And in that dimension, it's not dominated by thought, by images, by belief structures, by opinions, by all the rest. It's not seeking, it's not trying to attain. It doesn't see things as separate. From the dimension of being, there's also the sense and the knowing that everything is also this being. Behind every pair of eyes you'll ever meet is actually being. And the same being, the same pure being, that same awake emptiness. No matter who you look at, no matter what the exterior is, it's just being. Right behind the veil that we present to each other. And that is the dimension of being, that's the dimension of awakening. That's the dimension of enlightenment. You've probably heard many times, it's been said for hundreds of years, in many different traditions. Die before you die so that you may truly live. In Zen they call it the Great Death, very dramatic, the Great Death. I think sometimes these kind of phrases over-dramatize things a bit. You know, you don't want to ruffle the me up too much. You know, if you start talking about its death and its demise and its dissolution and all that, it gets very anxious. And it's, you know, it's hard for it to see beyond itself when it's very anxious, you know, but they're pointing to something. They're just basically these kind of sayings of die while you're alive so you can truly live. It's just a way of saying, let go of one way of perceiving things, let go of the exterior of you, and automatically your consciousness will transfer over to the being. And when it transfers over to the being, there's true life. There's true life, what Buddha called nirvana, what Jesus called the kingdom of heaven. Same thing. Nirvana's not over there, and it sure as hell isn't in another lifetime, or another dimension, or anywhere else. Neither is heaven. Heaven's not up in the clouds somewhere. You know, that's like childish nonsense, but it's an insult, because children know better than that. Until we convince them otherwise, you know? Children are living in a type of heaven until we come and convince them that they're not.